Okay, we're going to pick up with part 2 of the Chapter 17 lecture by talking about niche. So, every organism in a community has a niche, and a niche is simply defined as the role of the organism in the community. Now, depending on what the niche is, they're going to have different requirements. So, niche features can include how much space the organism requires, the type of food and the amount of food the organism needs, when does the organism reproduce, what temperature and moisture conditions can they actually live in, what organisms do they rely on for a food source, and ultimately, how do they influence competitors? So, an example of a niche would be something like being a predator or being a prey, being a decomposer, being an herbivore. These are all roles of an organism in the community. So, there are two types of niches that any species can have. You have what's called a fundamental niche, and you have what's called a realized niche. The fundamental niche is all of the environmental conditions that a single species can live under. So the entire plethora of different environments it could live in, different food sources it could have, different conditions it could tolerate. All that's fundamental niche. Then you have what's called the realized niche, which is actually the narrow role the species actually occupies in reality. So in reality, while maybe a species may be able to occupy a large range of environments or a larger area of a habitat, it may not actually in real life actually occupy all of those areas. It might just occupy a single area. Or for example, of a food source, maybe it can eat 3 species of different kinds of prey, but in reality it actually only eats 1 because that's the one it has the best access to. And with those and with the change from fundamental to realized, that has a lot to do with the species interaction and competition. We'll get back to that in a second. But first, I'm going to talk about coevolution and how this also impacts species interacting with each other. So coevolution is this idea that organisms modify their traits when they interact with another species to allow them to adapt to the other. What that means is if species A has some attribute that ultimately improves its fitness, then species B that interacts with it is also going to have whatever trait allows it to interact with species A get selected for, so it can also improve its fitness. Basically, think of 2 organisms that hang out or interact consistently. Ultimately, are both going to be selected for those traits that play off each other. An example of this is with the orchid flower in Madagascar, as well as the moth and their tongueling. So the orchid flower that I'm circling right here has a very long track down to get the nectar and pollen at the base of the flower. Ultimately, not a lot of organisms have a narrow beak or any sort of structure to reach all the way down that canal. However, the moth ultimately has an adaptation of a very long tongue. That tongue can actually reach all the way down the flower and reach the nectar. So the way coevolution is going to work is that because the moth has a long tongue and is capable of reaching down the flower, those flowers are going to successfully reproduce because the moth is going to transfer pollen. So then the flower is ultimately going to reproduce and be successful. And then those moths with the longer tongues are able to get food, to get the nectar from the flower, ultimately be satiated, have the energy to reproduce. And more moths with long tongues are going to be selected for to be able to get food sources from the flower. So both the flower and the moth play off one another. And how this interactivity ultimately factors into fundamental niche and realized niche is with this idea of competition. So competition is all about species clashing over resources. Resources can be things like space, so where they actually occupy, or they can be things like food, like what they actually get to eat, how much of it do they get to eat. So with competition, this occurs when you have 2 niches that overlap. So let's say you have 2 predators going after the same prey. Both those predators are going to compete for the prey. They both can't have 100% access to them because other species may occupy a similar role. The example your book gives is with 2 paramecium in a test tube. So this is an example of ultimately competing over space. So in this first step, you have the yellow paramecium that I'm circling on the left, and the purple paramecium I'm circling on the right. They are each in their own test tube right now, their own environment. That would be an example of fundamental niche. So they can occupy all of the test tube because they have no other competition in their environment. Then in the second scenario, we put both the yellow paramecium and the purple paramecium in one test tube. And ultimately, when you have two species that occupy an area or occupy a similar niche, you can have one of two things happen. The first one is called competitive exclusion. This is when one species basically outcompetes the other for either the food source or the space source or whatever they're competing over. Ultimately, that's going to drive one of the species to extinction. In this case, the yellow paramecium drove out the purple paramecium, and they're all completely dead. Their population was wiped out. So the only remainder is the yellow paramecium. The other scenario that can happen is what's called resource partitioning. Resource partitioning is basically when the resource in question, in this case space, it could be food also, is broken up, and they are basically divided between them. They're using resources slightly differently to allow both species to survive. So in this case, the yellow paramecium is using the top half of the test tube, and the purple paramecium is using the bottom half of the test tube. So when this happens, there's no competition over space. They're making a compromise and inhabiting a certain section of the test tube, so both of them can actually thrive. So one of them is basically a bottom feeder, and one of them is a top feeder for the test tube. And what happens when organisms utilize resource partitioning, and this happens more often than not, most of the time we don't have competitive exclusion, because if we did, a lot of species wouldn't survive. Everyone would just drive every other species out. You have what's called character displacement. And this is when you have some sort of evolutionary adaptation that makes the allocation of resources possible. So species are able to use a resource in a different way. And this character displacement can be something like a structural change for a species, or it could be a behavioral change. The example we have here is with our finches on the Galapagos Islands, because we love using that as an example in this book. In this case, you have a species of finch on these smaller islands here and here, and they eat a specific kind of seed, or they eat two kinds of seeds. They eat these white ones and these green ones. And since they're the only species on those islands, ultimately they can do whatever they want. But however, on the middle island, both those types of species occupy it. So instead of competing for both seeds against one another and one driving the other out, one species changes its beak size, so it's larger to eat more of the larger seeds. And then the other species gets a smaller, more needle nose-like beak to be able to pick out the small seeds from the trees. So ultimately, those species changed a structural component of their of their anatomy to allow them to use one resource efficiently. So either the larger seeds or the smaller seeds. Okay, so with coevolution, we talked about coevolution interacting between species, and we talked about a sort of beneficial example with the orchid and the moth. But another type of coevolution that occurs is with predation. So predator and prey are a relationship, and predation is just the interaction where one species eats the other species. The prey is eaten by the predator. And while it may not seem obvious at first, predators are actually a very strong selective force in the prey, because the predators are actually eating the prey, not allowing those prey to survive, not allowing those prey to pass on their genes, because they have no more fitness since they're gone, they're dead. So because organisms are eaten by predators, they have a lower reproductive success. Since there's less organisms in the population of the prey, there's less opportunities to reproduce. And in order for prey to ultimately survive predators, they have a handful of different types of defenses they can utilize to evade predation. So the first category is physical defenses, so physical features that prey have to avoid predation. And the first physical feature that some organisms have are mechanical defenses. So some sort of bodily attribute that can either hurt the predator or make it less enticing to have them get attacked because they'll be harmed. In this example, we have quills on the Malayan porcupine. Also, hedgehogs are another great example of having a physical structure that would hurt a predator where they try to eat it. Next, we have chemical defenses, and these are toxins or some sort of unpalatable odor or liquid that the animal can give off that ultimately will make the organism sick or die from eating it. An example, we have the strawberry poison dart frog, which can give off a toxin if eaten by a predator. Next, we have warning coloration. This is a sort of precursor step to chemical defenses, in that the organism's coloring can actually act as an indicator to the predator that, hey, I'm poisonous. If you eat me, most likely you will die. Ultimately, the predator will see this warning coloration and realize that when we see this color, this means that this is a toxic or poisonous animal, so we're going to stay away from it. So without having to actually be eaten, the color can actually give off a lot of information to the predator. And lastly, we have camouflage. Camouflage is all about blending of your surroundings. So with camouflage, the prey will have a color or a body pattern or some sort of shape to make it blend in with the background, and ultimately have the predator not be able to spot it or pick it out in its environment. So those are physical defenses, physical attributes that the organisms have to not be eaten. There are also behavioral defenses, so physical things that organisms can do in order to not be eaten. So two broad groups we have for behavioral defenses. First one is hiding or escaping. So hiding, the animal can, if it's smaller, potentially hide under rocks or in some sort of cover in order to get away from the predator. Or in the case of an aquatic example, you can have fish that school together and group up so that you have a very huge mass of fish and have safety in numbers. So a predator is less likely to be able to pick you out individually if you're in a big mob. Additionally, you can potentially have structures that allow you to run away or escape or climb or run or any sort of locomotion to get away, to escape. Additionally, you have fighting back as part of a behavioral defense. This one's a little less common, but some prey actually have abilities to attack their predator to basically stun them or to confuse them to be able to get away. So an example like this is the fulmar, which is a seabird that actually defends its nest by projectilely vomiting at the predator. And I imagine if you had a person projectile vomit at you, you would be less likely to attack them. There are other examples as well. I believe there is a lizard that is able to squirt blood out of its eye as well using its eye pressure. So these are sorts of last-ditch efforts to ultimately confuse and get away from the prey or the predator. However, despite prey having all of these things, predators actually have evolved their own efficiencies as part of coevolution to be able to track down prey and eat them. So predators may have better sensory perception. They may have sharper vision or better hearing to ultimately pick out prey or detect prey more efficiently in their environment. They may have evolved the ability to eat toxic prey. So maybe there is a predator that has got an adaptation that could eat potentially a poison dart frog or a monarch butterfly or something of that nature. And then the prey would then have to have an adaptation to produce a stronger, more potent toxin or a more different toxin. And this would go back and forth potentially. Additionally, sort of like camouflage, predators can actually utilize mimicry. So they may actually also be able to blend in with their environment and use that as a surprise tactic to catch prey when they're off guard because they don't think there's any predators around. Additionally, they may just have a better overall capturing ability. So potentially being able to run faster, swim faster, fly faster, be able to catch up to prey more easily. However, even though predators also have evolutions to increase their efficiency to get prey, there is what's referred to as the life dinner hypothesis. What this hypothesis basically tells us is that the escape ability or the ability of the prey to get away from the predator is actually stronger than the selection for the capture ability. So natural selection actually favors the prey and not the predator. Even though predators will still evolve abilities to catch prey, ultimately the prey is going to have the better chance. The reason for this has to do with fitness. So when the prey is ultimately eaten by a predator, that prey is dead. It's no longer alive. It's no longer able to pass along its genes, and ultimately has thus decreased fitness. And that's a huge detriment to its population. However, if the predator doesn't actually catch the predator doesn't die. The predator doesn't lose its ability to be fit and pass on its genes to the next generation. The predator just misses a meal. The predator could potentially catch a different animal or go after a different food source and ultimately be able to stay alive. If the predator always caught the prey, then we would always have a amount of prey that were wiped out, and we would have populations of prey get wiped out all the time. But because the amount of fitness is so crucial, based on the ability of the prey to stay alive, natural selection will always favor that prey. Okay, so a couple more types of interactions we have within communities are parasitism, commensalism, and mutualism. So the first one we're going to talk about is parasitism. And parasitism is a sort of subset of predation. And the idea behind parasitism is that one organism, the parasite, acts as or gets a benefit from a host. And the parasite will benefit from the host by taking some sort of fluid or nutrients that can use to nourish itself. So in this case, or in all cases for parasitism, parasite is benefited, the host is harmed. Parasites have two types. We have ectoparasites and we have endoparasites. Ecto means outside, so ectoparasites are parasites that live outside of the host. And then you have endoparasites, and these are parasites that live inside the host. So something like a bedbug or a tick is an example of an ectoparasite because they basically are still remaining outside the host. They're just puncturing through the skin or through the tissue to suck up blood. Endoparasites, since they have to go inside the host, actually have to be ingested and get into the human host or the animal host or whatever they're infecting to ultimately be able to siphon off nutrients. So parasites are a unique kind of predator. However, unlike predators, they are not bigger and stronger and faster. They have a number of unique challenges and features they have to deal with. The first one is size. So size is kind of a double-edged sword with parasites. Parasites are very small, so they're not able to be detected very easily by their hosts. However, because the parasites are so small, moving around isn't very convenient. It takes a while to get to a host. They have to be able to conveniently move from host to host. Additionally, staying in contact with the host may be difficult. If you're an ectoparasite, you may get detected by the host. So if someone's a tick, they're going to pull it out. Or if you take your dog to the vet, they're going to hopefully pull out any ectoparasites they may have. Additionally, if an endoparasite, your body's defensive system is going to try and flush out those parasites to get out of the body. So the endoparasite has to be able to stay inside the actual host to get nutrients from it. Additionally, the parasite has to be able to live off the host without actually killing it. Parasites are going to cause a detriment to fitness for whatever animal they're infecting. So if they're there for too long, that animal is ultimately going to die and the parasite will lose its nutrient source. So it has to be able to siphon off nutrients or or blood or whatever it's siphoning off, but it can't overdo it, otherwise it will kill the organism, which is not helpful. And lastly, parasites have to be able to disperse, which kind of goes hand in hand with the size. Since parasites are so small and getting from one organism to another may take a while, if they're getting from human to human or mammal to mammal or however they're doing it, that may be a little more difficult, and they may have to go through some intermediate steps to accomplish this. So in order to disperse, many parasites have evolved really complicated life cycles from coevolution, so co-evolving with their host. So basically, they can have more than one host species involved to get from to get to their next host. They can infect multiple hosts throughout a cycle. So, examples of some parasites adaptations that we have: parasites when they infect their organism can cause a change in their behavior, which ultimately helps them carry out their life cycle. A couple examples we have. First one is called toxoplasma. This example, when they infect their host, they induce really foolish, fearless behavior. Example is a toxoplasm can infect a rat, and ultimately the rat, which should have a natural fear of cats or feral creatures, may be very bold and may now go next to those cats and not go next to the cats and ultimately hang around them. Ultimately, the rat, since it's infected, isn't able to control its body motor function. So more likely, since it's hanging around a cat, the cat's going to eat the rat, and the toxoplasma is going to move from the rat to the cat. So kind of a clever way to get around the ability to disperse. Another example we have is that parasites can ultimately induce really high levels of aggression for their hosts. A big example of this is with rabies. So when rabies infect any sort of larger mammal, ultimately you can have the animal get very rabid and try and attack and bite another individual. And ultimately you can transfer the saliva, which carries the rabies, from the biter to the person that gets bit. Lastly, an example we have is parasites can also induce more sort of risky behavior or strange behavior that doesn't make sense for the animal. So the example for this is called the lancet fluke. This is an endoparasite. And ultimately this can actually infect ants. And what the ants do is, our ants normally live in colonies. They don't usually leave the colony by themselves unless they're going to get food or another resource. But in this example, they'll leave the colony and the ant will actually walk up to the top of a stalk of a piece of grass or other plant, basically exposing itself to any sort of other predator. And that predator, of course, will then eat the ant if they get spotted, and that fluke will get passed from the ant to the predator, or get passed from the ant to the whatever predator eats it, thus passing along the fluke. So parasites are very clever in how they're able to manipulate their host to pass themselves along to the next individual. And besides parasitism, we have two other types of interactions that are non-negative. So we have what's called mutualism, and we have what's called commensalism. So for mutualism, this is when both species benefit. So when you have an interaction between both species, both of them have an improvement in fitness. Example we have with this is we have a swamp aster flower gets pollinated by a bumblebee. The bumblebee is carrying the pollen to other flowers to ultimately help with reproduction. But at the same time, the bumblebee is also being nourished by the plant's nectar, so it's getting a food source from this as well. So honeybee's happy because it's got the food, flower's happy because it's got the ability to reproduce. Then we have commensalism, and in commensalism, in this case, we have one species that gets benefited, but the other species is unaffected. So example we have here, the cattle egret, that's the white bird right here, feeds on the insects that are stirred up by the Cape buffalo. So the buffalo doesn't really get anything out of this interaction. It just happens to whip up insects, but the cattle egret gets free food from this, free insects. So it benefits because it gets nourishment, but the cow isn't being harmed or hurt by this. This is just sort of a byproduct of the cow trying to get insects away from it. Okay, so one of the last things we're going to talk about is this idea of succession. So in any sort of community, there is change over time. Communities aren't static. There's always changes with species coming in, species coming out, disturbances happening. And when you have a disturbance in a community, this is what's referred to, or the response from disturbances is referred to as succession. It's a process of gradual change. And succession has two types. We have primary succession and we have secondary succession. So with primary succession, in this case, there is no life when this process starts and there's no soil. There's no ability to get life when we start primary succession. Ultimately, the goal is getting to what's called a climax community, which is a stable community of whatever ecosystem we're looking at. Secondary succession is basically starting from some sort of big disturbance in a habitat. So in this established community, there's still life in soil, but there's been some amount of destruction from either a man-made cause or a natural cause. But ultimately, succession is going to occur, and we're going to get to back to a stable climax community. So for primary succession, remember we're starting with no life and no soil. An example of this would be something like going from a volcano, which is just lava and ash, starting out and going all the way to a forest. So with primary succession, this can take tens of thousands of years because we're started with no life ultimately. And what's going to happen is the area with no life, we're going to have what's called colonizers or pioneer species arrive on the scene. These are things like your fungi, your bacteria, lichens, any other small seeds from plant life, kind of initially colonizing the area and getting initial life going and getting the breakdown of the rock into soil. So the soil can then grow plants. Big idea of these colonizers is that these colonizers are very good dispersers. They're able to get their seeds across the environment so more plant life can ultimately grow. In time, you're going to have intermediate communities, so things like mosses and really small plants. Then you're going to have herbs and ferns, eventually small trees and shrubs, and then larger trees. So you'll go from the colonizing community to the climax community. Then with secondary succession, we're not starting from nothing. We're starting just after a disturbance. So we still have life in soil. So this is going to happen overall at a faster rate. We just have a setback because we had some kind of disturbance in the community. But ultimately, since you have that soil established already, you're just going to start at the second step with mosses and other really small plants growing, going to herbs and ferns, small trees, and then larger trees getting into a climax community. With secondary succession, ultimately, following the disturbance, you may have dead organisms or dead organic matter, and ultimately those decaying remains are going to feed into the soil to help keep it fertile. All right. So that's primary and secondary succession. And the very last thing we're going to talk about in the communities is what's called a keystone species. So a keystone species is basically a species in whatever community we're looking at that holds a very prominent place, a very important place in the community, such that if you remove that keystone species, that community is actually going to fall apart. It's going to have huge ripple effects for whatever community we're looking at. So keystone species are incredibly important for conservation because of that. An example we have of this is with the sea stars. So these are the orange ones and the purple ones I'm circling. The sea stars in this community are predators of mussels. These are the black shells that I'm circling here and here. And they act as a natural predator of them. We need predation to keep populations of organisms that are lower on trophic level down, because if we don't have them, we have a population explosion of them, and that may cause issues. So in this case, if we remove the sea stars from the organism, our keystone species, ultimately have a population explosion of mussels, and ultimately the mussels actually drive out all the other competitors. So all of your other intertidal life, like your barnacles, and so on and so forth. So when we remove that one species, there's a huge ripple effect because the one species, the mussels, blew out of control in terms of population growth, and it drove out every other type of species. So ultimately, we weren't able to preserve all those ones because we removed that keystone species, thus highlighting their importance in a community. So that is all we have for chapter 17. I will see you all next week for chapter 18, the final chapter.